My daughter locked me out of her mother's hospital room the night my wife of 41 years took her last breath. The nurse who came to find me in the hallway looked at the floor when she told me I had arrived too late. I still had my coat on. I had driven from the hardware store in 40 minutes flat when my son-in-law called, and I was still too late. That same night, sitting in my truck in the parking lot of St. Lot, Michael's Hospital in Vancouver with the engine running and nowhere to go, I made a phone call that my daughter would spend the next 2 years trying to undo. My name is Gordon Whitfield. I am 67 years old, and what I am about to tell you is the hardest thing I have ever put into words. Margaret and I met in the fall of 1983 at a community planning meeting in North Vancouver. She was 26 and working for the city as a junior planner. I was 29 and had just started my second year running a small general contracting company I had built from a weekend renovation side business. She was presenting a slide about green space requirements for residential development, and I was in the back row eating a sandwich because I had not had time for dinner. She caught me chewing during her presentation and raised one eyebrow so precisely, so deliberately, that I actually laughed out loud in the middle of a city council meeting. She did not smile. She finished her presentation. Then she walked straight to the back of the room afterward and said, very quietly, "I hope that was worth it." I told her it was the best sandwich I had ever had. We were married 18 months later. Those first years were lean in the way that only people who have built something from nothing will understand. Margaret kept her city job while I grew the contracting business. We shared a 2-bedroom townhouse in Burnaby and drove the same used pickup truck on alternating days. I took jobs most contractors passed on. The difficult renovations, the houses other people had walked away from mid-project, the basement flood restorations that took 3 times as long as anyone estimated. Margaret came to job sites on weekends and helped me with permits, blueprints, the city approval processes she understood better than anyone. We were partners in the truest sense of the word, the kind that only happens when 2 people decide early on that there is no version of this life that does not include the other one. Our daughter was born in the spring of 1987. We named her Claire. She came into the world screaming with a full head of dark hair like her mother, and we held her in that hospital room in North Van and cried the way you only cry when something happens that you will spend the rest of your life being grateful for. I want you to understand who Claire was when she was young, because I think you cannot understand what came later without knowing who she was then. She was sharp, funny. She had Margaret's precision and her way of noticing details that other people walked past. She used to come to job sites with me on Saturdays when she was 8 or 9, and she would find the one measurement I had written wrong on a cut list and point to it without saying anything. Just tap the paper with one finger and look up at me. She was the kind of kid who made you proud just watching her think. The business grew through the 90s. Whitfield Construction became known in the Lower Mainland for the kind of work that holds up. We expanded into commercial renovation, then light industrial, then residential development. By 2005, we had 42 employees and 3 active project sites at any given time. Margaret had left the city by then to manage our operations full-time. She ran the office, managed the accounts, handled the subcontractor relationships with a directness that contractors either respected or were afraid of. Usually both. Claire graduated from UBC with a degree in business and came to work with us for a year after. She was good at it. But I could see she was restless in a way I did not know how to address. She had grown up watching Margaret and me build this thing together, and I think somewhere along the way, she had decided she did not want to live inside someone else's legacy. That was fair. I understood that. What I did not understand was Nathan. She met him at a conference in Calgary in 2013. He came from money in the way that people come from money when it was inherited rather than earned, with a confidence that did not match his actual accomplishments, and a habit of talking about the future in terms of what he deserved rather than what he intended to build. He was 38 when they met, 15 years older than Claire. He had a consulting business that seemed to generate income in ways that were never clearly explained. I asked Margaret once what exactly Nathan did, and she said he talks to people who have money about what to do with it. And then we sat with that for a while in silence. I tried. I want to be honest about that. I hosted him at our home, I invited him to our projects, I sat across from him at 100 dinners, and I tried to find the version of him that Claire saw. There were moments when I caught a glimpse of it. He was intelligent. He was charming in a way that was clearly well practiced. But there was something underneath the charm that I could not name. Something watching, calculating. Margaret named it on a Sunday drive in the fall of 2015. About a year before the wedding, she said, "Gordon, that man measures every room he walks into." I asked her what she meant. She said, "He always knows exactly what everyone in the room has and what he would need to do to get it." I told her she was being too hard on him. She let the subject go. Margaret always knew when to let a subject go. Claire and Nathan married in October 2016. The wedding was at a venue in Whistler that cost more than I had spent on my first piece of commercial property. I paid for it without complaint because Margaret wanted that day to be beautiful for her daughter, and I wanted everything Margaret wanted. During speeches, Nathan thanked the Whitfield family for their generosity and their legacy and their support. And the words were all the right words. But the order they came in felt like he was reading a list rather than speaking from somewhere real. After the wedding, things shifted in a direction I told myself I was imagining. Nathan began appearing at the construction offices more frequently, always with ideas about modernizing the business structure, expanding into real estate development rather than construction, moving the company toward what he called a higher margin model. His consulting background gave him the vocabulary to make these ideas sound sophisticated. I listened. I engaged. I asked hard questions. He always had answers that were just technical enough to sound credible and just vague enough to avoid being tested. Margaret listened too, and after each of these conversations, she would say very little. On the way home from the office one evening in 2018, she told me, "He is not interested in building things, Gordon. He is interested in owning things that are already built." She was right. She was almost always right. I want to tell you about the last 2 years Margaret was alive, because they are the part of this story that most people will not talk about. The part that happened quietly in hospital rooms and kitchen chairs and long drives to appointment after appointment. And I think those years are the years that matter most. Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in January 2020. Stage 3. The oncologist at BC Cancer was honest with us in the way that good doctors are honest, which is to say, she did not soften it into something comfortable. She told us the treatment was aggressive and the statistics were difficult, but that Margaret was strong and the cancer had not spread to her lymph nodes, and that there was real reason to fight. Margaret's first call after we left that appointment was to Claire. Claire came to Vancouver that weekend and sat with her mother for 3 days. She held her hand through the first chemo consultation. She cried in the car on the way to the airport when she left. For those 3 days, she was exactly the daughter Margaret had raised. Then she went home to Calgary, and the calls got shorter, and the visits got further apart, and Nathan's presence in them became increasingly difficult to ignore. "Mom," Claire said to Margaret on a call in March, "Nathan thinks it might be a good idea for us to limit our exposure to the stress of the medical situation. He says it isn't healthy for us to absorb the emotional weight right now." I was in the kitchen when Margaret took that call. She held the phone against her shoulder for a long moment after she hung up, and then she said to me, very quietly, "My daughter just told me that my cancer is stressful for her." I drove 6 hours to Calgary that weekend. I sat across from Nathan in a restaurant he had chosen on a street in a neighborhood I did not know, and I told him, without raising my voice, that my wife was fighting for her life, and his job right now was to support my daughter in being present for her mother. He listened with that practiced expression that looked like empathy and was not. He said he understood. He said, of course. Of course. He said family was everything. The calls did not get longer. The visits did not come more frequently. I did not tell Margaret about that conversation. There are things you protect the person you love from when they are already carrying everything they can carry. I was with Margaret every day. I canceled contracts, handed project management to my site supervisors, told my operations manager to call me only if something was actively on fire. I drove Margaret to chemo every Wednesday and sat in the chair beside her and read to her from whatever she was working her way through. She had a thing for Canadian history and was partway through a biography of Louis Riel that she found endlessly funny in a way I did not entirely follow. I cooked dinner every night, which Margaret found both touching and concerning because my cooking had never been one of my strengths. I learned. I got better. She told me on a Tuesday in November that the soup I had made was actually good, and the way she said it, like she was genuinely surprised, made me laugh so hard I had to sit down. We had 41 years of moments like that. Claire visited twice in 2020, twice in 2021. Nathan came once and spent most of the visit on his phone in the guest room. In the spring of 2022, when the cancer came back after a 6-month remission and the oncologist sat across from us and used the word palliative for the first time, Margaret made me promise 3 things. She made me promise to keep the company running as something she and I had built together, not what anyone else decided it should become. She made me promise to not let grief make me small. And she made me promise to leave a door open for Claire, no matter what happened. I promised her all 3. There is a notebook Margaret kept in the drawer beside her bed in the last 8 months of her life. She wrote in it when she had energy, sometimes at 2 in the morning when the pain medication had her awake and thinking. I did not read it until after everything fell apart. What she wrote there was not a diary. It was instructions. It was the plan of a woman who loved her family so much that she had spent months lying awake, making sure she had protected what mattered most. I did not know then what she had seen coming. I should have. Claire called me in mid-September 2022, about 3 weeks before Margaret died. Her voice was careful in a way I had learned to recognize as Nathan's influence. She told me she had been speaking with a family counselor, that the counselor felt it was important for her to set boundaries around the end-of-life process, to preserve her own mental health, and that she and Nathan had decided it would be best if they coordinated Margaret's final care arrangements going forward. She said Nathan had already spoken to the hospital about adding her name to the care documentation. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant that care decisions and visitor coordination would go through her. I told her quietly that I was Margaret's husband and that no piece of paper was going to change what that meant. She said she knew that and she was sorry, and she loved me. She sounded like she meant it. I think some part of her did. I should have called a lawyer the next morning. I did not. I was sitting beside my wife's bed at St. Michael's Hospital, and I did not have the space in me for anything that was not Margaret. The night Margaret died, a Thursday in October, I had stepped out to the hardware store on East Hastings because we had a job site with a plumbing problem that needed a specific part, and I had not sent anyone because I told myself I would be back in 40 minutes and nothing would happen. I had let 100 times. Nothing had ever happened. I came back to the hospital, and the nurse met me in the hallway, and I understood before she said a word. Claire was inside the room. The door was closed. A woman I did not recognize was standing beside it. "I'm sorry," the woman said, "but Ms. Whitfield has asked for no visitors at this time." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "I am Gordon Whitfield. I am her husband." The woman looked at a clipboard. She said my name was not on the approved visitor list for immediate family. I stood in that hallway for 6 seconds that I will remember until I die. Then I turned around and walked to the elevator and went down to the parking lot and sat in my truck. And I called my oldest friend, a man named Tom, who had known Margaret since the year we met, who had stood beside me at our wedding, who had held my hand at more hard moments than I could count. I told him what had happened. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Gordon, call Bernard tomorrow, first thing." Bernard Okafor had been my corporate lawyer for 22 years. That night, I drove home to our house in North Van, the house Margaret and I had renovated together when Claire was 3, the house with the garden Margaret had designed, and the back deck she had made me rebuild twice until the angle of the boards was exactly right. I sat at the kitchen table, and I opened the drawer where we kept the documents that mattered, and underneath our passports and the copy of our mortgage discharge was a sealed envelope in Margaret's handwriting. It said, "Gordon, when you need it." I sat with that envelope for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a letter, 4 pages in Margaret's careful handwriting, and a separate sealed envelope addressed to Bernard Okafor, with a note clipped to it, for Bernard. "He will know what to do. I will not share everything," Margaret wrote to me that night, because some of it belongs only to me. But she told me she had seen what was coming for almost 2 years. She told me she had watched Nathan quietly work on Claire's perception of me and the business, isolating her from her own family history, reframing every decision Margaret and I had ever made as controlling or limiting or beneath what Claire deserved. She told me she had spent the last 18 months working with Bernard to restructure our family assets in a way that protected what we had built. And she told me she was sorry she had not told me sooner, but that she had not wanted me to spend our last years in a war when we could spend them in love. She told me she loved me more at the end than she had on the first day, which she had not thought was possible, but it was. I called Bernard at 7 in the morning. I will not go into the specific legal details because the point is not the mechanism. The point is that Margaret had been thinking clearly for a very long time. Whitfield Construction did not operate as a single entity. It was structured through a holding company that Margaret and I controlled jointly, and upon Margaret's death her share transferred not to Claire, as Nathan had apparently assumed, but to the Margaret Whitfield Family Trust, administered by Bernard, with governance provisions that required any major operational or ownership change to pass through a board that included 2 independent trustees Margaret had appointed herself. Nathan had apparently done extensive research on the operating company. He had apparently not discovered the holding structure, or he had assumed incorrectly that the documents he had coached Claire to bring to me at Thanksgiving 2 months earlier, documents I had signed because Claire had cried and told me this was what her mother would have wanted for their future, and I had believed her, gave them control of things they did not, in fact, control. The first sign that something had shifted came on a Monday morning when Nathan called the company's main line and asked to speak to the finance director about transferring operational authority. He was told that no such transfer was pending. He called back. He was told the same thing. He called me that afternoon. His voice was different from any version I had heard before. The polish was gone. "Gordon," he said, "I think there has been a miscommunication about the documents Claire brought to you." I told him I did not think there had been a miscommunication. He said they should come to Vancouver to sort things out in person. I said that was not necessary. He said Claire was very upset. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said I was making a mistake. I did not answer that. Claire called an hour later, crying. Not the careful, Nathan-adjacent crying I had heard in the last 2 years. Actual crying, the kind that is hard to fake, and that I had not heard from my daughter since she was 17 years old and had her heart broken by a boy who did not deserve her. She said, "Dad, I don't understand what is happening. Nathan said the company accounts are frozen." I told her the company was operating normally. She said Nathan was saying that I was trying to take back something that was supposed to be hers. I told her that her mother had not left her nothing. I told her that what Margaret had left her was not the company, but that was not the same as nothing. I told her that if she came to Vancouver alone, without Nathan, I would sit down with her and Bernard, and we would go through everything Margaret had arranged, because her mother had been very specific and very thoughtful, and Claire deserved to understand what her mother had actually wanted for her. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Without Nathan." I said yes. She came 3 weeks later, alone. She sat across from me and Bernard in the boardroom at Bernard's office on West Georgia Street, and we spent 4 hours going through Margaret's plan. I watched my daughter's face as she understood, piece by piece, that her mother had seen everything, had seen Nathan, had seen what was being built around Claire to separate her from her own family, had tried to protect her from it while simultaneously protecting the company and, more than anything, protecting Claire's relationship with me. Margaret had left Claire a substantial RRSP inheritance, the paid-off house in Calgary that she had quietly transferred into a trust in Claire's sole name, not joined with Nathan, 18 months before she died, and a letter. I did not read that letter. It was between a mother and her daughter. Claire sat in that boardroom, and she cried for a long time. She told me she did not know how long Nathan had been steering her. She said she had started to see it more clearly after her mother died. Small things. The way he had framed every visit to Vancouver as a cost, every phone call with me as Gordon being difficult, every piece of our history as evidence of parents who had held her back, rather than given her everything. She said she had told herself these were just Nathan's anxieties about the business, not something deliberate. She said she had been wrong. Nathan and Claire separated 8 months after Margaret died. The divorce was finalized 14 months later. I will not say anything more about Nathan, because he is no longer worth the words. What I want to tell you about is a Sunday last April. Claire drove up from the city to North Vancouver. She pulled into the driveway of the house she grew up in, and I had coffee waiting because I remembered she takes hers with a splash of oat milk, which Margaret had taught me because I had been getting it wrong for years. We sat on the back deck that Margaret made me rebuild twice, and we looked at the garden that was coming back after a winter that had been hard on everything. And we sat with the grief and the loss and the complicated wreckage of the last 2 years. And we were just a father and a daughter on a deck in the spring. She told me she was sorry. I told her that her mother had known she was a good person, being worked on by something that was not good, and that the difference between those two things was everything. We sat there until the light changed. The Emily Miller Foundation houses 200 families. The Margaret Whitfield Skilled Trade Scholarship now sends 8 young people a year through the BCIT Construction Trades program in her name. Margaret always believed the trades were where people built real things in real lives, and that they were chronically undervalued by a world that confused a university degree with intelligence. The scholarship was her idea, written in that notebook beside her bed at 2 in the morning, and I found it 3 months after she was gone, and I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time when I read it. Every year at the scholarship ceremony, I stand up and I say a few words. I tell the students that the person whose name is on this award was the smartest person I ever met, and that she spent 41 years making sure that other people got to build things that lasted. I tell them that legacy is not what you leave in a will. It is what you make possible for people you will never meet. I am 67 years old. I still go to job sites. I still make soup that surprises people. I still drive the same route to the same hardware store on East Hastings, and every single time I pull into that parking lot, I sit for a moment and I think about what I would do differently. I would have left the store earlier. That is the only thing. Everything else. The years we had, the life we built, the way Margaret wrote me 4 pages by hand because she wanted me to hear her voice in the words. Everything else I would not change for anything this world has to offer. If this story moves something in you, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Some nights, it is the only thing that reminds me how many people in this world understand what it means to love someone completely and to keep going after they are gone. I think about that hallway more than I talk about it. The nurse's face. The way she looked at the floor. The coat I still had on. There is a version of that night that could have broken me permanently, and for a while it did. But what I have come to understand, slowly and without any comfort in the understanding, is that what happened to me and Margaret did not begin with Nathan. It began the moment Claire stopped asking questions and started accepting answers from someone whose interest was never her well-being. That is not blame. That is just how these things move through a family, quietly, over years, until one night a man is standing in a hospital hallway in his coat and the door is closed. What Nathan understood about people was real. I will give him that. He knew how to take something that was genuinely painful, a daughter's complicated feelings about growing up in the shadow of parents who built something big, and turn it into a door he could walk through. That is a particular kind of intelligence, the kind that reads people accurately and uses what it finds. But intelligence without integrity is just a tool with no handle. You can pick it up, but eventually it cuts you. Nathan was precise and calculating for years, and then one morning the accounts were frozen and he had nothing. Because he had built everything on a foundation that was not his, and foundations that are not yours do not hold. Margaret understood this. She understood it earlier than I did, and she did not panic, and she did not give in to bitterness. She sat in that hospital bed with a notebook, and she thought clearly about what mattered and what needed protecting, and she made a plan. That is not a small thing. Most people, facing what she was facing, would have spent their remaining energy on grief or anger. Margaret spent hers on thinking, on being useful to the people she loved, even after she was gone. I have turned that over in my mind 1,000 times, and I still find something new in it. The steadiness it took, the love it required, the refusal to let fear make her small. I was not always steady. There were months after she died when I was not much of anything. What got me through was the same thing that got the contracting business through the 2008 recession and a 2015 slowdown and every difficult project I ever said yes to. You keep going, not because it stops hurting. It does not stop hurting. But because the alternative is to become the story that happened to you, and I was not willing to do that. Margaret was not willing to do that. That unwillingness is its own kind of strength, the kind that does not announce itself, that just shows up on a Monday morning and starts again. Claire is finding her way back. That is not a simple sentence. It is a whole life of work she is doing, and I watch her do it with the respect I do not always have words for. She chose, when she finally had enough space to choose clearly, to be honest about what had happened. That took more courage than most people will ever be asked for. What I want to say to anyone watching this who is somewhere in the middle of a story like mine is this. The people who try to take what you have built are counting on you to be too tired, too heartbroken, too trusting to look clearly at what is happening. Margaret was none of those things, and because she was none of those things, 8 young people a year are learning a trade in her name, and I am sitting on a deck in North Van watching a garden come back to life. That is what she left, not the company. That